Hey, welcome back to the channel, or if you're new here, welcome to the channel. I'm Nick, and I make videos about things that I like. Today, we're going to be checking out some of the most cozy retro gaming handhelds that you can own. So, without any further delay, let's get into it. For me personally, this is probably the single most iconic handheld gaming device ever made. For me, this is handheld gaming and honestly retro gaming in general. Now, I know, there are lots of other retro consoles and devices that came before this, but there's just something so incredibly compelling about the DMG Game Boy. Is it bulky? Yes, absolutely. Is it that typical grayish that all tech from the 80s seems to be? Yes, absolutely. But that's what makes it stand out to me. I know that for the time, the design wasn't really all that stunning or outstanding, but in today's world, in the sea of glass slabs that we have, there's a personality to it which really makes it special in my eyes. There's just something so unique about the playfulness in the design too. It's not too out there in its formal elements, but it's allowed to be interesting in its own way. There's something really compelling about every aspect of this design for me. I think part of it is that it is so iconic, so just holding it feels like holding a piece of technological history, but I also think that it does have a more objective appeal as well. The use of soft edges and rounded corners makes it feel inviting, and the thoughtful placement of these grip lines in the back makes it feel great to hold. And the formal motifs that you can see throughout the entire design play off each other perfectly. Like, take this particularly rounded bottom right corner, for example. It's mirrored from the bezels of the display. But that's not just for good looks. While it does help to make the overall form feel more dynamic by adding a bit of asymmetry, it's also completely functional. You're intended to use your right hand to control not just the A and B buttons, but also the menu buttons as well, and because of their placement, your thumb needs to be able to comfortably complete an arc to reach all these buttons with ease. Cutting away more of that corner than on the other side helps give you that range of motion. But that isn't the only tool that they use to make this action more comfortable. They also add a very slight chamfer to that edge on that corner, which takes away even more material and gives the fat of your hand somewhere to sit comfortably. You can see the advantage to this approach made clear by the way the analog pocket feels to play. While it's not a major criticism, the lack of rounded edges and other ergonomics-minded features makes for a decidedly less comfortable experience. Don't get me wrong, I love the analog pocket, but when comparing comfort to the DMG Game Boy, I have to give the edge to the DMG. And while I know for many people the pocketability of modern tech is an incredibly important selling point, I actually find the chunkier, beefier tech like the DMG just feels better to hold and to use. I can see the argument for a lack of sophistication and elegance in this kind of design, but I think the DMG is probably still one of the most welcoming and friendly pieces of handheld tech I've ever used to this day. They do a phenomenal job riding the line between toy and tech in a way I think a lot of companies still struggle with today. Now, to be clear, I think the aims of the teams making handheld tech today are much different than they were in the days of the DMG, so it makes sense that they would produce much different products. But my feelings remain. I don't think these companies should be shying away from allowing their devices to be on the larger side. Not only does it feel better to hold in your hand in general, but it would also allow for a lot more leeway when it comes to features that you can pack into your devices. I'm thinking specifically of cell phones. Just think of how many great features you could add if you took the iPhone and made it just a little bit fatter. Not only could you comfortably fit a headphone jack, but you could also get a huge increase in battery life, and the actual pocketability of the phone wouldn't really suffer in any material way. I'm not saying that all these companies should be making their phones exactly as chunky as the DMG, that would be kind of ridiculous, but the concept, the ethos, I think could be helpful in their design process. Okay, sorry, I got a bit sidetracked there. My point is that the DMG Game Boy is an iconic design for a reason, and it's not just because it was the first to the market at a time when something like that didn't exist. It's because it was a genuinely great product that people loved for good reason. I do genuinely think that it's elegant in its own way. Sure, the technical power is a bit underwhelming compared to something like a Game Gear, but the design is far superior than pretty much any other handheld in my eyes. Which I suppose will make it a bit difficult to transition to our next handheld. Now, I've done a video focusing on this guy before, specifically on its key selling point, the hinge. But today we're going to try to take a bit of a more holistic look at what makes this handheld so great aside from the obvious. The Game Boy Advance SP is yet another beautiful example of the design prowess from early Nintendo. Now, I said I would try to avoid talking too much about the hinge, and that is true, I will. However, it can't be completely ignored. It is a defining feature of the device, and it's part of what makes it a good fit for being on a cozy handhelds list. The clamshell design of the SP makes it the most comfortably pocketable handheld that Nintendo has ever made. Not just because, in its closed state, it's only about the thickness of 2 modern smartphones, but also because it allows you to carry it around with you without ever having to worry about the screen getting scratched or face buttons getting damaged. And then, when you do open it, you get to experience the true advantage of its design, which is just how thin they were able to make it. Now, I know in the previous section I was just talking all about how I think thicker devices are better, and designers shouldn't be striving to make a device thin for thinness sake, and I stand by that, but I think the SP has pretty much nailed it when it comes to thickness. I think they hit the sweet spot for thickness. It has the advantages of being thin, like feeling sleek and elegant, while also benefiting from the more friendly feeling you get from devices that are on the thicker side. They're able to still play around with the design because they have the room to make interesting choices. They aren't limiting themselves to like 5mm to work with. And that allowed them to do interesting things like give it a cartridge slot, which is just one of the most satisfying interactions you can put into a device. They're able to have toggle switches instead of simple solid-state buttons. They can have actual real data ports, but it still feels like a technical jump over the previous designs. And again, this doesn't feel like either a toy or a piece of tech, it feels like both, and they ride that line with real skill. But what makes it cozy? We get that it's a good design, but what is it that makes me consider this device cozy? Well, for me, it's all in the mechanical interactions. I think tech nowadays leans far too much to the digital. Don't get me wrong, I understand why that is. I know it's much easier to simply code in certain functions with software buttons, and making what precious few physical buttons we do have solid state allows us to have incredibly water-resistant devices. But those solutions, while clever and a great way to save cost and cut down on potential points of failure, they don't have the it factor that mechanical solutions do. And that's something I find brings that cozy feeling more than almost anything else. There's just something fundamentally different about slotting a cartridge into your device and feeling all the pins lock into place, or toggling a power button, or scrolling a volume wheel. I'm sure part of it is the fact that it takes me back to when I was younger, and when that kind of tech was more common. And as we all know, nostalgia and rose-colored glasses are a huge contributor to something feeling cozy. But I also think those physical interactions, those mechanical mechanisms, have something inherent to them that you simply can't replicate with even the best haptic motors in the world. You just can't beat the feeling of a good toggle switch, or a really nice hinge, or a fader with just the right amount of resistance. It's just something you don't get from tech these days. And perhaps from a certain point of view, that makes sense, but I just can't help the feeling that tech would be better if it just had a bit more of this cozy ethos infused into it. I'm not saying we should go back to the good old days, but I don't think we have to throw it all out whole cloth. But let's move on to our last handheld. The Game Boy Color feels in many ways like it should, a more polished, more mature, more tightened up version of the DMG. While I love the DMG and the way that it feels, it's just a bit on the loose side. Now, this might just be due to the age of mine, but everything on it just feels a bit loose, save for the cartridge slot, which is still totally fine. But the battery door and buttons are just a bit loose, and while it's definitely not light with the batteries in it, you can absolutely feel all of the empty space in there. The Color, on the other hand, now that's a tight handheld. The manufacturing ability at Nintendo clearly had a great jump in terms of quality from the DMG to the Color, and I should hope that would be the case. The Color just feels like exactly what a second product should be. Everything the first thing was, but more and better. Now, I know on the original hardware, the screen lacked a backlight, so that's a clear negative. However, the screen itself is actually kind of astounding. I can't show you on camera because I had to do a bunch of soldering to get the LCD mod done on the one that I have, but believe me when I tell you, LCD looks good, but Color LCD looks amazing. It has this kind of shimmer to it that you don't get with anything else, and while the colors may not be the most saturated, and Again, it's almost impossible to see in dark conditions. When you can see it, boy is it ever something to look at. I really can't explain it other than it kind of has the same shimmery grain that something like an Etch-a-Sketch has, but in color and with perfectly delineated pixels. Talking about the screen though brings up an interesting point about why I feel this handheld deserves to be considered cozy. I think an important part of older tech, which is often overlooked, is the inconvenience factor. Now, I know, the usual ethos is to make tech as simple as possible and as invisible as possible. You should just want it to get out of your way and let you accomplish the task at hand, and I understand that desire. However, I do think there is a real value to having to learn the ins and outs of a tool. My thought on the matter is this. A tool has two main outcomes: the thing that you're producing with it, and the effect that it has on you, the user. And the argument against complicated, complex systems is that if the thing that you're using has too many complications, you're gonna have a negative association with it. And perhaps that's true, but I do think there is value to the process of using a product. If my phone, for example, was the absolute most simple it could be, and it just read my mind and did exactly what I needed without me ever having to interface with it at all, sure, it's functionally brilliant, but in my opinion, it fails as a product. I had no dialogue with it. There was no back and forth. There were no problems to solve, no hurdles to overcome. I didn't have an experience, and so there's no way for me to build any kind of connection with that product. There's this really great little historical anecdote about the car culture here in the US. A lot of other countries don't really understand our love for having our own cars, and aside from the, functional reasons, a lot of it is just a matter of culture. See, the story goes like this. When World War II soldiers came back from the war, they had built up this really tight bond with the Jeeps that they drove. This piece of machinery kept them alive. It gave them shelter and the ability to get on the move and out of danger. So they came back and were looking for that, and long story short, that had a huge impact on why personal cars are so deeply ingrained into our culture here. But those soldiers didn't have that connection because their car just always worked and always did exactly what they needed without hesitation. No, they built that connection because they had to take on the upkeep of the car. It was a give and take. They kept the car alive, and the car did the same. And it's that connection that we lose when we design away all the quirks and flaws in a product. I'm able to call these handhelds cozy, not because they're perfect and are just a flawless box that lets me play games. No, they're cozy because they have a personality. They have flaws and quirks that, sure, might get in the way of a pure experience, but those quirks and flaws make me feel connected to these handhelds in a way that I don't get with a lot of modern tech. Most of my connection to, say, my phone comes from its monetary value. I don't want to lose it or break it because it's expensive, but I don't want to lose or break these because they're my handhelds, and having modded them to be just how I like adds even more to that. Now, these aren't just off-the-shelf handhelds, they're specifically mine. Just like how much of car culture centers around modding and improving your car, the same goes for retro handhelds because, let's be serious, they won't run in their stock state forever, so they'll need to be modded at some point to keep them going. And by doing that, we actually improve on them and make them suit our specific needs better. And through that process, we can increase our personal connection with these little pieces of hardware. I really love my retro handhelds, and to my mind, they're everything that cozy gaming stands for. They connect us to the past in a really tangible way, and they also give us something to look forward to and to anticipate. They're always there for us, and I mean, frankly, the games available on these systems are some of the most cozy things out there, and it's pretty hard to go wrong. I think I'm going to end it here, though. I hope you've enjoyed listening to me ramble on about retro handhelds, though this was really just kind of a good excuse for me to gush about some of my favorite things that I own, but I hope you were at the very least entertained, and hey, maybe you learned something too. Either way, go ahead and leave a comment about what your personal favorite retro handhelds are, and hey, maybe you want to tell me about why I'm wrong about mine. That works too. But regardless, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss a video. Also, we have memberships available on the channel now, so if you would like, you can go ahead and sign up for one of those two tiers. They're both exactly the same in terms of what you get, so just sign up for whatever works for you. I would really appreciate it. Also, you don't have to sign up at all. Just subscribing, just watching these videos supports me more than I can ever really say thank you enough for. So yeah, that's that pitch out of the way. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. I hope to see you here next time. And as always, happy gaming.